Good morning and happy Sunday or happy Lord's Day again. Today we are going to be looking at Mark chapter 15, verses 21 through 41. And this will be the second part of the humiliation of the king, or the question that we're going to consider today is, what is greatness? And we're going to see that the way up is down. The way up is down. So what is greatness? I looked this question up online, and I found one definition of greatness in a person is a state of exceptional superiority or a quality that sets someone apart from others. It can also be defined as a person's character and contribution to the world around them. And I began to think about what makes Jesus great, because that's really what we're considering. And that's the center of the message of the Bible, is the greatness of God in Jesus that is shown as he works out his plan with his people. So what makes Jesus great? So his origin story. I decided to use that phraseology because some people like the origin story of a superhero or some kind of character in a book. It's the origin story. Well, he's God. He is the divine Son of God. He had glory with the Father before the world was formed, in John 17 verse 3. And then he took on a human nature. He came in the likeness of man. He was born of a virgin. So this unique way that he came, and his humble beginnings with that he didn't come to a royal family. He came to a carpenter's family. He came to a woman who had no particular status in the community. But then in his ministry, some things that made him very great: his powerful miracles, opening the eyes of the blind, opening the ears of the deaf, raising the dead, Lazarus come forth. His authoritative and transformative teaching. We still look at his word and are transformed by it today. And he speaks as one who had authority. His care for the lowly and outcast. He was known as a friend of sinners, and that he had compassion on people as a sheep or as a shepherd looking at sheep without one. His courage and willingness to call out corruption. Certainly he looked around at the corruption, and he spoke very poignantly, especially in Matthew 23, to the religious leaders who were, as he said, binding heavy burdens on the people, but unwilling to lift them with a single finger. They were straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. They had missed the main thing of what it meant to follow God and to be his leaders in the community. And his zeal to do his Father's will. He always did his Father's will. He always spoke what his Father wanted him to speak. And it says, zeal for your house will consume me. Let's think again. So that's one definition of what is greatness. Let's think about another definition. And this comes by way of a story from Mark chapter 9, where they're walking down the road, and then they get to a particular place of stopping, a house, and Jesus asks his disciples, hey, what were you guys talking about on the way? And as it turns out, they were ashamed because they were talking about who is greatest. And he sat them down and, he sat down and called them and said, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. So this is where we get the idea of the way up is down. So he says, whoever would be greatest must be the servant of all. So what makes Jesus great again? Let's move one chapter forward in Mark to Mark 10, verse 45. It says, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. There is no more profound humbling that we can point to but that of Jesus. He is the divine, eternal Son of God. Just taking on human nature and being born as a man was amazing humility. Then his entire life, and especially his ministry of service to others. But this humble service and Jesus' greatness reached a climax at the cross, which is what we're looking at today. The voluntary sacrifice of Jesus, where he gave his life on the cross to pay for the sins of others, to be a ransom for many. This is the single greatest act in history, and the one that we remember most. Almost everybody who's ever heard of Jesus knows about his death on the cross. This is greatness. We said the way up is down, so we're going to look in this passage at the end of the way down for Jesus, his profound suffering and humiliation in his crucifixion, and the victory he won through it. So just by way of context, he has been betrayed, he's been tried before, he's been abandoned by his disciples, denied by Peter, tried before the high priest and found guilty for blasphemy because he admitted that he is the Son of God. Then tried before Pilate and found guilty really only because Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowd who was shouting for the death of Jesus. And through it all, however, Jesus is fulfilling the scriptures and accomplishing salvation. So now let's take a look at verse 21. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him, and the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him. We'll stop there. And then we'll move on to the next passage. So he was so weak at this point that because he had been scourged that he couldn't carry his own cross. He began, it says the Gospel of John, but then apparently he became too weak to carry it, so they forced Simon of Cyrene. So this gives you just an idea of where he's at in the level of weakness. And yet they offer him wine mixed with myrrh, which would be my understanding is a bit of a painkiller, and he refuses it. He is going to take the full brunt of the wrath of God. They crucified him, which, if you've ever seen The Passion of the Christ, is an intensely painful, agonizing way to suffer and die. It is also a very shameful way to die. This was to be public, very public. It's not often a separate place where you can't be seen. It's very public. He's naked, completely naked on the cross, and this is a sign of shame and also a sign of cursing. It's written in Galatians 3:13. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who's hanged on a tree." And that comes from one of the books of the law. So Jesus is being shown as cursed by God by his crucifixion on the cross. One thing that's notable in this whole passage, and what we've read, is how Jesus is passive. Things are being done to him. He's not the subject of the sentences. They is the subject word of most of the sentences. They brought him to Golgotha. They offered him wine. They crucified him. They divided his garments and cast lots. And yet it's fulfilling Scripture. God is in perfect control of all that's going on. It's fulfilling Isaiah 53:7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. They fulfilled Psalm 22:18. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. They fulfilled Isaiah 53:12. It says that he was numbered with the transgressors, with the criminals, really probably the fellow insurrectionists, probably Barabbas's companions. Barabbas got off, but his companions did not. So he's fulfilling Scripture in the midst of his humiliation. And the inscription of the charge, "The King of the Jews," was meant to be a criminal charge against him, but it's true. And this is the way he's saving his people. The king is saving his people not by overcoming his enemies by force, but actually by dying for them. So he's crucified, then he's mocked. It says, and those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. This is fulfilling Psalm 22, verses 7 and 8. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. So it's basically mocking him and saying, if you really trust in God, God should deliver him. And in it, Jesus is entrusting himself to God. Now, how tempting it would be, because Jesus is perfectly innocent, and he could come down from that cross. How tempting it would be to correct these mockers. But it says in 1 Peter 2:23, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. And note the things that they're saying: save yourself, essentially. Come down, and we'll believe in you. But these are the words of Satan coming through man, really. Just as Satan had tempted Christ to try to get the kingdoms of the world without having to go through the cross at the beginning of his ministry, now again he tempts him to come down from the cross and get glory without the cross. But no, he cannot save himself so that he will save others. He can't come down from the cross and save himself in order that he will save others. So he's crucified, he's mocked, and then forsaken. Verse 33, and when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, "Behold, he is calling Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." As painful as the physical punishment, the public shame, the mocking and scornful statements, the most painful thing for Jesus was being for a time forsaken by God as he bore the sin of the world. Jesus was taking the wrath of God against sin. And in this, while this is happening, he quotes again, fulfilling Psalm 22. Psalm 22:1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning?" But in this, he is acting as a propitiation for sins, according to Romans 3:25. That is, that he is bearing the sin and taking the punishment for the sins of others. And so God has to pour out wrath on him so that we don't have to take the wrath of God ourselves. And yet in this, he finally is victorious. So crucified, mocked, forsaken, and yet victorious. In verse 37, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." Jesus did it. He gave his life all the way, suffered to death, and yet that very point of death was victory. Jesus accomplished what he came to do. And I appreciate one commentary that I read mentioned this, and it was powerful. The Gospel of Mark began with the announcement by his Father that Jesus is the Son of God at his baptism, when the heavens were torn open. So the heavens torn open, announcement, this is the Son of God. This is my beloved Son. Now, the curtain, the separation between man and God was torn open, and Jesus was again announced to be the Son of God. but this time by a Gentile soldier. It's kind of bookends in the Gospel of Mark, if you will. And let's just take a look at a couple passages in the New Testament which talk about what this victory that Jesus accomplished. In Colossians 2, verse 13 through 15, talking to Christians, it says, "And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, you were dead when you were outside of Christ. God made alive together with him." So he's accomplished through this and through his resurrection what is needed to be able to make us who were dead alive. And anyone who is dead alive, dead in their sins, make them alive with Christ, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed, so he did that by nailing the record of debt to the cross, by forgiving our trespasses. The only way it's able to be forgiven is for it to be paid for by Christ. And in this, he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. So his death brought salvation and actually triumphed over the rulers and authorities. And it's not just talking about the earthly rulers and authorities, it's talking about the Satan and his demons. And the other verse, or the other passage, is Philippians 2, 5 through 11. It says, "Have this mind among yourselves." So it's encouraging Christians to take a look at the example of Jesus in his humiliation, so that we will have a mind of service for others. "Who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is the Lord, to the glory of God the Father." So in this humiliation, Jesus is exalted because of what he's done, because of what he's accomplished. It says, therefore God has highly exalted him. His Father has highly exalted him. It's not that he is the nature of God. His divine glory has not increased, but his ascribed glory he's put out to all creation as the reconciler, as the one who has conquered, as the one who has won salvation. And so he receives this glory in creation because of what he has done. And finally, he was witnessed. It says, "There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem." So this is said kind of in passing, but these women, first of all, it's important that they were there. It shows that some of his disciples were faithfully there. We know that from the Gospel of John that John was also there, but the witnesses were important to be able to help record these events for us. There needed to be witnesses. And then it also leaves us with this question: do we receive and believe the truth of these things? Do we believe that Jesus is the Christ and the Son of God? Do we believe that he died to save sinners? If so, will we be witnesses to these things for others? We who have gotten to see by grace through faith his humiliation and his exaltation. Let us now go out and take this message to others and tell of others of the greatness of Jesus.